The Wyoming wind cut through the February afternoon like a cavalry saber, sharp and merciless. Margaret Sullivan stood alone on the windswept platform as the mail coach pulled away its wheels, churning through frozen mud and old snow. She clutched her carpet bag with both hands, the only possession she had left in this world, besides the worn blue dress on her back and the letter folded inside her coat pocket. The letter that had brought her 2,000 miles from Boston to this God-forsaken wilderness. The letter from a dead man. She hadn't known Samuel Dalton was dead when she'd boarded the train in Boston 3 weeks ago. She'd known only what his letters had promised: a home, a husband, a fresh start far from the suffocating grip of her stepfather's house. Samuel had written beautiful words about wide open spaces and mountain sunsets, about building something real together, about children running through fields of wildflowers. His penmanship had been elegant for a frontiersman, his promises sweet as honey. All lies, as it turned out. Not intentional, perhaps, but lies nonetheless. Samuel Dalton would never marry her. Samuel Dalton would never build her a home or give her children or show her those mountain sunsets. Samuel Dalton had been in the ground for 3 weeks, shot dead by cattle rustlers in the foothills north of his family's ranch. The ranch that now stood before her, sprawling across the valley floor, like a kingdom carved from wilderness and willpower. Dalton Ranch. The name was burned into a wooden arch that spanned the main gate, the letters darkened by weather and time. Beyond the arch, a dirt road wound between whitewashed fences toward a cluster of buildings half a mile distant. Even from here, Maggie could see the scope of it. The main house, 2 stories of timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. The barn, massive and red, with a hayloft that could hold a season's worth of feed. Smaller outbuildings scattered around like satellites, each with its own purpose. Bunkhouse, smokehouse, blacksmith, shed, chicken coop. This was what Samuel had built. This empire of wood and sweat and Wyoming earth number. Not Samuel. Maggie knew enough about ranching now, after 3 weeks of traveling through cattle country, to understand the truth. A spread this size took decades to build, not years. This was the work of Samuel's father and his father before him. Samuel had merely inherited it. And from what the stage driver had let slip during the long journey, nearly destroyed it with gambling debts and poor decisions. The stage driver had also mentioned Samuel's brother. The older brother who'd come back from the war, different, harder, meaner. The brother who'd buried a wife and child and never smiled again. The brother who now ran Dalton Ranch with an iron fist and a loaded Colt revolver. The brother who was walking toward her right now. Maggie saw him emerge from the barn, a tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. He moved with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to his body, to its strength and its limits. Even at this distance, she could see the width of his shoulders, the length of his stride. He wore dark pants tucked into worn boots, a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, despite the cold, and a leather vest that had seen better days. A gun belt rode low on his hips, the holster tied down in the fashion of men who expected to use it. As he drew closer, Maggie could make out his features. A strong jaw shadowed with 3 days of beard growth. High cheekbones that spoke of some distant native ancestry, perhaps on his mother's side. Eyes the color of Wyoming sky in winter pale blue and just as cold. Hair dark as coal touching his collar in the back. He looked to be in his early 30s, but his eyes were older. Much older. He stopped 10 feet away and studied her with the same expression a man might use when examining a horse at auction. Not hostile, but not friendly either. Calculating. Measuring. "If you're here to see Samuel," he said finally, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder, "you're 3 weeks too late." His words hit her like a physical blow, even though she'd already known. Hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way the stage driver's sympathetic mumblings had not. "I know," Maggie said, lifting her chin despite the trembling in her knees. "The driver told me, but I had nowhere else to go." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. Up close, she could see the lines etched around them, the permanent furrow between his brows. This was a man who'd seen too much and forgotten how to stop seeing it. "You're the mail-order bride." It wasn't a question. "The one from Boston." "Margaret Sullivan." It was gone too quickly for Maggie to be sure. "Because you weren't the only one," he said flatly. "Samuel wrote to half a dozen women, maybe more. He was looking for a wife with money, someone who could help clear his gambling debts. I found the letters after he died, tucked in a box under his bed, like stolen candy." The words stung more than they should have. Maggie had harbored no romantic illusions about Samuel Dalton. She'd accepted his proposal for practical reasons to escape the gilded cage of her stepfather's house in Boston. But learning she'd been one of many that Samuel had been shopping for a wealthy bride like a man shopping for cattle made her feel foolish and small. I see, though, she managed her voice steady despite the burning in her throat. Well, for what it's worth, I have no money. My father died when I was 16, and my mother remarried a banker who had no interest in supporting me beyond the minimum required by social convention. I worked as a seamstress to save enough for the train ticket west. So if Samuel was hoping for a rich wife, he would have been sorely disappointed. Jack studied her with those cold blue eyes, and Maggie had the uncomfortable feeling he could see straight through to her bones, to all the secrets and fears she'd tried so hard to bury. The stage driver told me you had no return ticket, he said finally. That's correct. No money for one either, I'd wager. Also correct. And no family to wire for funds. Maggie thought of her mother, weak and worn down by years under Victor Hayes's thumb. Thought of her stepfather's business partner, the man who'd cornered her in his study 6 months ago and made his intentions horrifyingly clear. Thought of the locked door and his breathing heavy and eager, and the letter opener she'd grabbed from his desk. The way his eyes had widened when she'd pressed the point against his throat and told him she'd kill him if he ever touched her again. She'd left Boston the next day. Her mother hadn't stopped her, hadn't even said goodbye. No, Maggie said quietly. No family. Jack was silent for a long moment. The wind howled through the valley, carrying the scent of snow and cattle and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed mournfully. There's a storm coming, Jack said, nodding towards the northern horizon where dark clouds were building like an army massing for battle. Biggest one this winter, according to old Bull Morgan. He's been reading weather patterns since before I was born, and he's never wrong. That storm hits the pass, will be closed for weeks, maybe months. I see. The nearest town is Sweetwater, 40 miles east. If you started walking now, you might make it before dark. Might, but you'd be gambling with your life, and that storm would catch you halfway there. Maggie looked at the distant mountains, their peaks already shrouded in clouds the color of gunmetal. And in exchange for this work, you'd provide me with shelter and food. And passage money come spring, enough to get you to Oregon or California or wherever the hell you want to go that isn't here. Jack's voice was hard, leaving no room for negotiation. This isn't charity, Miss Sullivan. You work, you earn your keep, and come spring, we part ways. No obligations, no promises. Just business. It was a cold arrangement, businesslike and impersonal. But Maggie had learned long ago that the world rarely offered warm welcomes or generous terms. This was survival, pure and simple. I accept, she said. Jack nodded once, then bent to pick up her carpet bag. Follow me. I'll show you where you'll be staying and introduce you to Rose. He started toward the main house with long, ground-eating strides. Maggie hurried to keep pace, her city boots slipping on the icy ground. She could feel his impatience in every step, his desire to have this conversation finished and return to whatever work she'd interrupted. The ranch hands paused in their work to watch as they passed, men in worn clothes and battered hats, their faces weathered by sun and wind. They looked at Maggie with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. One of them, an older man with silver hair and a pronounced limp, tipped his hat respectfully. Another, younger and darker skinned with kind eyes, offered a small smile. Jack didn't introduce her, didn't slow his pace or acknowledge the men's interest. He simply walked, and Maggie followed, feeling more alone than she had even on the train platform in Boston. The house was warmer inside, heated by a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the front room. The space was masculine and sparse, furnished with heavy wooden furniture and decorated with practical items rather than ornamental ones. Rifles hung on the walls alongside horse tack and old cavalry equipment. A bearskin rug covered part of the wooden floor. Books lined a shelf near the fireplace, their spines cracked and worn from use. The sound that drew Maggie's attention was small and pitiful, a whimpering cry from somewhere deeper in the house. That's Rose, Jack said, setting down Maggie's bag near the stairs. She's been fussy all morning. Mrs. Chen from town usually comes by to help, but she couldn't make it today because of the coming storm. Maggie followed the sound through a doorway into what appeared to be a bedroom. The room was neat but austere, containing little more than a bed, a dresser, and a wooden cradle near the window. In that cradle wrapped in a patchwork quilt was the smallest, angriest baby Maggie had ever seen. Rose had a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably settle into the same pale blue as her uncle's. Right now, they were screwed shut as she wailed, her tiny fists waving in the air like a prize fighter's. Her face was red with fury, or hunger, or both. "How long has she been crying?" Maggie asked, already moving toward the cradle. "Hour, maybe two." Jack stood in the doorway, his large frame filling the space. "I tried feeding her, but she won't take the bottle. Changed her diaper. Walked with her. Nothing works." Maggie lifted Rose from the cradle, automatically supporting the baby's head, the way her mother had taught her years ago when helping with neighborhood infants. Rose was lighter than she'd expected, fragile as a bird. The crying intensified for a moment, then began to ease as Maggie settled the baby against her shoulder and started a gentle rocking motion. "There now," Maggie murmured, her voice soft and rhythmic. "There now, little one. You're all right, you're safe." She could feel Jack watching her from the doorway, his gaze heavy and assessing. Rose's cries faded to whimpers, then to small hiccuping sounds. The baby's tiny hand grabbed a fistful of Maggie's hair and held on like a drowning person clutching a rope. "You're good with her," Jack said after a moment. His voice held something that might have been surprise or approval. It was hard to tell. "My mother used to help the other women in our neighborhood when they had babies," Maggie said, still rocking gently. "I learned by watching." "Samuel never mentioned you had experience with children." "Samuel and I never discussed children. We discussed weather and literature and the general principles of ranching. Nothing personal, nothing real." Jack was quiet, and when Maggie glanced at him, she found him studying her with those penetrating eyes. Not with attraction or interest, but with the same careful calculation a general might use when evaluating a new soldier. "I'll show you the kitchen," he said finally. He stood near the fireplace, his back to the flames, his face cast in shadow. "The men who killed Samuel, they're still out there. A gang led by a man named Ezra Crowley. They've been rustling cattle from ranches all over the territory, and they're getting bolder. Samuel caught them trying to steal from our herd, and they shot him for it. The law hasn't caught them. The law out here is stretched thin, Miss Sullivan. One sheriff trying to cover 3 counties. Crowley knows how to stay ahead of posies, how to disappear into the mountains when things get hot. He'll strike again. Maybe here, maybe somewhere else. But he'll strike." "Why are you telling me this?" Jack's eyes met hers, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Maggie saw something other than cold calculation in them. She saw warning, and underneath that, barely visible, a flicker of genuine concern. "Because if you stay here, you need to understand the danger. This isn't Boston, Miss Sullivan. This is the frontier. Men die here for no better reason than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Women too, if they're unlucky. If that storm hadn't been coming, I'd have put you on a horse and sent you to Sweetwater myself. But since you're here, since you're going to be living under my roof and caring for my niece, you need to know what you're walking into." "I appreciate your honesty," Maggie said quietly. Rose had fallen asleep against her shoulder, the baby's breathing soft and even. "But I have nowhere else to go, Mr. Dalton. Whatever dangers exist here can't be worse than what I left behind in Boston." Something shifted in Jack's expression. Not softening exactly, but a slight easing of the hardness around his eyes. He looked at her for a long moment, and Maggie had the sense that he was seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time. "Jack," he said finally, "I'm sorry. You called me Mr. Dalton. If you're going to be living here working for this ranch, you should call me Jack. Formality doesn't suit the frontier." It was a small concession, but Maggie recognized it for what it was. An acknowledgement that she existed, that she was more than just an inconvenience to be tolerated until spring. "Then you should call me Maggie," she said. "Margaret is my mother's name, and I'd prefer to leave that behind with everything else from Boston." Jack nodded once, then turned toward the door. "I need to get back to work. There's stew in the pot on the stove if you're hungry. Help yourself to whatever you need. Your room is the second door on the right upstairs. I'll have one of the men bring up water for washing later." He was almost through the door when Maggie called after him. "Jack," he paused, half turned back toward her. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not sending me away." For a moment, she thought he might say something. His mouth opened slightly, and she could see him weighing words, considering responses. But in the end, he simply nodded and walked out into the cold afternoon, leaving Maggie alone with a sleeping baby and a house full of ghosts she couldn't yet see. The storm hit that night with a fury that shook the timber walls of the ranch house. Maggie lay in her bed upstairs, listening to the wind howl like wounded wolves and the snow hammer against the windows. She'd placed Rose's cradle in her room, unwilling to leave the baby alone on her first night in this strange place. The child slept peacefully despite the storm's rage, apparently accustomed to the violent weather of her mountain home. Maggie couldn't sleep. The bed was comfortable enough, the quilts thick and warm, but every creak of the house, every gust of wind, every distant sound made her heart race. She kept thinking about what Jack had said about the outlaws, about Samuel's murder, about the dangers of this wild land. Checking the house before bed, making sure everything was secure against the storm and whatever other threats might be lurking in the darkness. Maggie returned to her bed and lay awake for another hour, listening to the storm and thinking about the man down the hall. The man who'd lost his wife and child, who'd taken in his brother's orphaned daughter, who'd agreed to shelter a strange woman out of what might have been duty or might have been something approaching kindness. A complicated man, clearly. One carrying his own storms inside him, just as violent as the weather battering the house. Maggie finally drifted into an uneasy sleep sometime before dawn. When she woke, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. From her window, she could see the ranch hands already at work, digging paths between the buildings and tending to the livestock. Rose was awake in her cradle, staring up at Maggie with those unfocused infant eyes. Not crying, just observing with the serious expression babies sometimes have when trying to make sense of the strange world they've been born into. "Good morning, little one," Maggie said softly, lifting Rose and checking her diaper. "Let's get you fed and changed, shall we? Then we'll see about making ourselves useful around here." The morning passed in a blur of activity. Maggie fed Rose, changed her, bathed her in the kitchen basin with water warmed on the stove. She explored the house more thoroughly, taking inventory of what needed cleaning, what needed mending, what needed organizing. The place had the neglected feel of a home run by men without women, functional, but lacking the small touches that transformed a house into something warmer. She found Jack in the barn around mid-morning, working alongside 3 of his ranch hands. They were repairing damage from the storm, replacing boards that had been torn loose by the wind and reinforcing weak spots before the next storm hit. One of the men was the silver-haired older man who tipped his hat to her yesterday. He worked despite his pronounced limp, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to compensate for physical limitations. The second man was the dark-skinned one with kind eyes, younger and stronger, handling the heavy lifting with easy competence. The third was barely more than a boy, 19 or 20 at most, with an eager face and hands that moved too fast, trying to prove something. "Jack," Maggie called from the barn door. All 4 men turned to look at her, and she felt suddenly self-conscious, standing there with Rose bundled against her chest in a sling she'd improvised from a shawl. "I was wondering if there's a general store in town where I might purchase some supplies. Things for the baby and for the house." Jack set down his hammer and walked over, wiping sawdust from his hands on his pants. Up close in the better light of morning, Maggie could see the exhaustion in his face. Dark circles under his eyes. Lines of strain around his mouth. This was a man who didn't sleep well if he slept at all. "Doc Chen runs the general store in Sweetwater," he said. "But the roads won't be clear for a week, maybe more. What do you need? Fabric for diapers? Soap suitable for a baby's skin? Some herbs for cooking. Small things mostly." Jack considered this, then nodded toward the barn loft. "There's fabric up there, bolts of cotton and wool that my mother bought years ago. Never got used. You're welcome to it. As for herbs and such, check the root cellar. My wife planted a garden her first year here, and we still have dried herbs from that last harvest." His wife. The words hung in the air between them, and Maggie saw the other men exchange glances. This was clearly a subject rarely discussed. "Thank you," Maggie said carefully. "I'll see what I can find." She was turning to leave when the silver-haired man spoke up, his voice gravelly from years of shouting over wind and cattle. "Name's William Morgan, ma'am. Folks call me Bull. Been foreman on this ranch for 20 years, and I just want to say it's good to have a woman around the place again. Been too long since these walls heard a baby's cry or smelled a woman's cooking." The dark-skinned man smiled and nodded. "Jose Martinez, Senora. I am happy to meet you. And the pequeña bebé, she is beautiful. The young man just stared, his face flushing red when Maggie looked at him. He mumbled something that might have been his name, but it was too quiet to hear over the wind whistling through the barn. Tommy Ford, Jack supplied, came to us last year looking for work, still learning the ropes. Pleased to meet you all, Maggie said, and she meant it. These men had kind faces, weathered but honest. The kind of men her father would have liked. That afternoon, while Rose napped, Maggie climbed to the barn loft and found the fabric Jack had mentioned. Bolts of good cotton, slightly yellowed with age but still strong. She also found something else tucked in a corner beneath a tarp. A cradle beautifully carved with intricate patterns along the sides. Hearts and flowers and small birds in flight. This had been meant for Jack's child, the son who died with his mother. Maggie ran her fingers over the smooth wood, imagining the hours of work that had gone into it, the hope and love carved into every detail. She should have left it there covered and forgotten. But something made her carry it down from the loft, made her clean away the dust, and set it up in her room beside the plain wooden cradle Rose currently used. It seemed wrong to let such love and craftsmanship go to waste. And perhaps in some small way, using this cradle for Rose honored the child it had been made for. That evening, as Maggie prepared a simple dinner of stew and cornbread, she heard raised voices from outside. Jack and Bull arguing about something near the main gate. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear enough. Bull was insisting on something and Jack was refusing. When Jack came inside for dinner, his expression was darker than usual, his movements sharp and angry. He sat at the table without speaking, barely acknowledging the food Maggie placed in front of him. Trouble? She asked carefully, taking her own seat across from him. Bull thinks we should hire more men, double the night watch. He's spooked about Crowley's gang, thinks they might come back for another try at our herd. Jack stabbed at his stew with unnecessary force. I told him we can't afford it. Every dollar we have is tied up in cattle and equipment. We're barely making enough to cover expenses as it is. Samuel's gambling debts. Jack's eyes snapped up to meet hers, sharp and defensive. Then the anger drained away, replaced by resignation. You're going to hear about it eventually. Might as well hear it from me. Samuel owed money all over the territory. Cards mostly, some bad investments in a silver mine that never panned out. When he died, those debts became mine. I've been selling off stock to cover them, but there's still more than $2,000 outstanding. $2,000. A fortune. More money than Maggie had ever seen in her life. I'm sorry, she said quietly. That's a heavy burden to carry. It's my burden to carry. Samuel was my brother. His mistakes, his debts, his daughter, they're all mine now. Jack pushed his stew around his plate without eating. Just like this ranch. My father built it from nothing, spent 40 years turning wilderness into something productive. Now I'm watching it all slip away because Samuel couldn't keep his hands off a deck of cards. There was such bitter pain in his voice, such exhaustion. Maggie found herself wanting to reach across the table to offer some gesture of comfort, but she didn't know this man well enough for that, didn't have the right to intrude on his grief. Rose is using the cradle, she said instead. The one from the loft. I hope that's all right. Jack went very still. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't breathe. Then he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need to check the stock, he said, his voice flat and distant. Don't wait up. He was gone before Maggie could respond, the door slamming behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. She sat alone at the table, listening to Rose's soft breathing from upstairs and wondering what fresh wound she'd just unknowingly opened. The days fell into a pattern. Maggie rose before dawn, tended to Rose, prepared breakfast for Jack and any ranch hands who came by the house. She cleaned and organized, cooked and mended, learned the rhythms of ranch life. Jack was gone most of each day, working alongside his men from sunup to sundown. When he was in the house, he was quiet and withdrawn, speaking only when necessary. But Maggie noticed things. The way he paused outside her door, arced her each night, listening for Rose's breathing. The way he'd left a stack of firewood outside her room so she wouldn't have to carry it up the stairs. The way he made sure there was always hot coffee waiting in the morning, the pot set where she could reach it easily with a baby in her arms. Small kindnesses unspoken and unacknowledged. The gestures of a man who'd forgotten how to express care with words, but couldn't quite stop himself from expressing it through actions. On the fifth night after her arrival, Rose developed a fever. It came on suddenly, the baby's skin going hot and dry, her crying taking on a desperate quality that sent ice through Maggie's veins. She tried everything she could think of. Cool cloths, gentle rocking, soft singing. Nothing helped. Rose's temperature continued to climb, her cries growing weaker. Maggie flew down the stairs, still in her nightgown, and pounded on Jack's door. He answered immediately as if he'd been awake. Maybe he had been. His hair was disheveled, his shirt unbuttoned, but his eyes were alert, already scanning for danger. "It's Rose," Maggie said, not bothering with apologies or explanations. "She has a fever. I don't know what to do." Jack was moving before she finished speaking, taking the stairs two at a time. Maggie hurried after him, watching as he lifted Rose from the cradle with surprising gentleness. His large hands cradled the baby's small body, and he pressed his lips to her forehead to gauge her temperature. "Damn," he muttered. "She's burning up. We need to cool her down, but carefully. Too fast and we could send her into shock." "Tell me what to do," Maggie said. For the next 3 hours, they worked together. Jack gave orders with calm authority, drawing on knowledge Maggie didn't know he possessed. They bathed Rose in lukewarm water, changed her often, monitored her temperature constantly. Maggie prepared a tea from willow bark and honey, and together they managed to get small amounts into the baby's mouth. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the fever began to break. Rose's cries softened, her skin cooled. By the time dawn light began creeping through the windows, the baby was sleeping peacefully, her breathing even and strong. Maggie sagged against the wall, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave. She'd been so frightened, so terrified that this small life would slip away in the night, that she'd fail in her very first real responsibility. "You handled yourself well," Jack said quietly. He was sitting in a chair he'd pulled next to the cradle, his elbows on his knees, his face drawn with the same exhaustion Maggie felt. "Most people would have panicked. You stayed calm, did exactly what needed doing." "You're the one who knew what to do," Maggie said. "I was just following your instructions." "You're a natural," Jack insisted. "With her, I mean, Rose. You're good with her." It was the most he'd said to her in days, and there was something in his voice that made Maggie look at him more closely. In the gray dawn light, with his guard down and fatigue written across his features, he looked younger. Less like the hardened rancher and more like the man he might have been before grief carved away his softness. "So are you," Maggie said gently, "when you let yourself be." Jack's eyes met hers, and for a moment something passed between them. Understanding, maybe. Recognition of shared fear, shared relief. Two people who'd spent the night fighting for a child's life and won. Then Rose stirred, making a small sound, and the moment broke. Jack stood, moving toward the window. "I should check on the animals," he said, his voice returning to its usual gruffness. "Storm last night might have caused damage." "Jack," Maggie called as he reached the door. He paused, half turned toward her. "Thank you for helping with Rose, for knowing what to do." He nodded once, quick and sharp, then disappeared into the hallway. Maggie listened to his footsteps on the stairs, heard the front door open and close. Then she moved to the cradle and looked down at Rose, this small miracle of survival, this child who'd lost her parents but somehow found her way into Maggie's heart. "Your uncle is a complicated man," she whispered to the sleeping baby. "But he's a good one. I think we're going to be all right here, you and I. I think we're going to be just fine." That evening, while Rose slept peacefully and Jack was out checking fence lines with Bull, Maggie decided to explore Samuel's room more thoroughly. She'd avoided it until now, feeling like she was intruding on a dead man's privacy. But if Samuel had left clues about what Jack had mentioned about claims and debts, she needed to understand the full picture of what she'd walked into. The room was sparse, containing little more than a bed, a dresser, and a trunk at the foot of the bed. Maggie started with the dresser, going through drawers filled with clothes that still carried the faint scent of tobacco and whiskey. Nothing interesting there. The trunk was more promising. Inside, she found papers, lots of them. Letters from various women, all responding to Samuel's marriage proposals. Maggie read a few and felt a mixture of pity and anger. These women, like her, had been desperate enough to trust a stranger's promises. Most of them sounded poor. Some widowed, others simply alone and searching for something better. Beneath the letters, she found a ledger, and her heart sank as she flipped through the pages. Samuel's debts were even worse than Jack had indicated. Not just $2,000, but closer to $3,000. Money owed to card sharps, saloon owners, merchants. Even a loan from someone named Victor Carson in Denver, marked with interest rates that bordered on criminal. But at the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, Maggie found what would change everything. A leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Samuel's handwriting. She carried it to the window where the light was better and began to read. The early entries were mundane, notes about weather, cattle prices, minor ranch business. But about 6 months before Samuel's death, the tone changed. The entries became excited, almost frantic. Found something in the North Hills today. Rock formations that match the geological survey from '72. If I'm right, if the maps are accurate, this could be bigger than anything Father ever dreamed of. 2 weeks later, confirmed. Took samples to the assayer in Cheyenne. Gold present, but not much. But silver, God, the silver deposits are massive. Could be worth 500,000, maybe more. A month after that, filed claim papers today. Didn't tell Jack he'd want to use the money to pay off the ranch debts to expand the herd. Practical as always, but this is my find, my chance to be more than just the younger brother, the one who couldn't make it on his own. I'll develop it myself, hire my own crew. Once I'm rich, once I've proven myself, then I'll tell Jack. Then he'll have to respect me. The entries grew more paranoid after that. References to someone asking questions in town, someone showing too much interest in the Northern Hills. Then 3 weeks before his death, Crowley knows. Don't know how he found out, but he knows about the silver. Approached me at the saloon, made me an offer. Partnership, he called it. I told him to go to hell. This is Dalton Silver, Dalton land. He can't have it. But I'm worried. Crowley's not the kind to take no for an answer. Need to be careful. Need to watch my back. The final entry was dated the day before Samuel died. Saw Crowley's men watching the ranch again. They're planning something. I can feel it. Maybe I should tell Jack, ask for help. But what if he tries to take over? What if he uses this against me, claims the silver for the ranch instead of for me? I don't know what to do. All I wanted was to prove I was worth something, that I could be successful on my own. Now I might have brought death to our doorstep. God forgive me. Maggie closed the journal, her hands shaking. Samuel hadn't been just greedy. He'd been desperate for validation, for proof that he mattered. And that desperation had killed him, would have killed his daughter too if Jack hadn't taken Rose in. She heard boots on the stairs and quickly tucked the journal under her shawl. Jack appeared in the doorway, his face questioning. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, not accusatory, just curious. "Looking for answers," Maggie said honestly. She pulled out the journal and handed it to him. "I think you should read this." Jack took the journal, flipped through a few pages, and his expression darkened with each word he read. When he finally looked up, his eyes were hard as chips of ice. He knew Crowley was coming, knew there was danger, and he didn't tell me, didn't warn anyone. Jack's voice was dangerously quiet. He was willing to let his own family die to protect his pride. "He was scared," Maggie said gently. "Scared of being overshadowed by you. Scared of being the younger brother who never measured up. So he got himself killed instead, left his daughter an orphan and his brother with debts and enemies." Jack threw the journal onto the bed with enough force to make the mattress bounce. Damn him. Damn his pride and his secrets. "Jack, wait," Maggie said, an idea forming in her mind. "Before you dismiss this entirely, there's something I should do. Something that might help us later if we need it." "What are you talking about?" Maggie moved to the small desk in the corner of Samuel's room and found paper and ink. "My father had a colleague at Harvard, Professor Arthur Whitman. He's an expert in forensic document analysis, handwriting, verification, that sort of thing. If there's any question about Samuel's claim about the legitimacy of any documents, having an expert opinion could be valuable." "You think someone might challenge the claim?" "I think if there's as much silver as Samuel believed, people will do anything to get it, including forging documents or claiming Samuel sold them the rights before he died." Maggie began writing quickly. "I'm going to send Professor Whitman samples of Samuel's handwriting from these letters. If we ever need him to verify authenticity or testify about forgeries, we'll have already established a relationship." Jack watched her write, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite approval, but a grudging respect for her forethought. "You're more strategic than I gave you credit for," he said. "I had to be growing up in Boston society. The drawing rooms there are battlefields dressed in silk and lace. Maggie finished the letter and sealed it. I'll ask Bull to post this when he goes to town next. It's probably nothing, but if it becomes something, we'll be prepared. Smart, Jack acknowledged. Then he turned to leave, pausing at the door. Maggie, don't make excuses for Samuel. He made his choices, bad ones. And now we're all paying for them, but I'm glad you're here to help sort through the mess he left behind. It wasn't much of a compliment, but coming from Jack, it felt like one. Maggie tucked the letter into her pocket and returned to tending Rose, trying not to think about silver deposits and dead brothers and the dangers that might still be coming their way. The attack came 4 nights later, at 2 in the morning when the world was darkest and the ranch hands were deep in sleep. Maggie woke to the sound of gunfire, sharp cracks that split the night like thunder. She was out of bed before she was fully conscious, her heart hammering against her ribs. More shots, shouting, the panicked lowing of cattle. Rose woke screaming, and Maggie scooped her from the cradle just as Jack appeared in her doorway. He was fully dressed, gun strapped to both hips, a rifle in his hands. Get down to the cellar, he ordered, his voice sharp as broken glass. Take Rose and don't come out until I come for you. No matter what you hear, no matter how long it takes. Do you understand what's happening? Crowley's men, they were hitting the herd. Jack's face was hard as stone, all traces of the gentleman who'd helped her with Rose's fever vanished. This was someone else entirely, someone dangerous. Go, now. Maggie ran. She clutched Rose to her chest and flew down the stairs through the kitchen to the cellar door. The heavy wooden stairs descended into darkness, and she had to feel her way down with one hand while holding Rose with the other. Above her, she could hear more gunfire, men shouting, the thunder of horses' hooves. The cellar was cold and dark and smelled of earth and preserved foods. Maggie found a corner and crouched there, wrapping herself and Rose in her shawl. The baby was crying, frightened by her mother's fear, and Maggie pressed her close, murmuring nonsense words of comfort that meant nothing and everything. The battle raged above. Maggie counted shots without meaning to, trying to guess how many guns were firing, how many men were fighting. She heard glass break, heard someone scream high and agonized, heard the boom of a shotgun deeper and louder than the rifles. Then silence. Absolute and terrifying silence that stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Footsteps on the kitchen floor above. Heavy boots moving slowly. Maggie held her breath, held Rose tighter, and prayed with words she'd forgotten she knew. Maggie. Jack's voice rough but unmistakably his. Maggie, it's over. You can come up. She climbed the stairs on shaking legs, still holding Rose, who'd finally quieted to soft whimpers. Jack stood in the kitchen, and Maggie's breath caught at the sight of him. Blood on his hands, blood on his shirt. A cut above his left eye that was still bleeding, running down the side of his face like war paint. Are you hurt? She set Rose in the cradle near the stove and moved toward him without thinking, her hands reaching for his face. Let me see. I'm fine, Jack said, but he didn't pull away when her fingers touched his jaw, tilting his head to examine the cut. Just a graze, looks worse than it is. It needs cleaning, sit down. It wasn't a request. Maggie pushed him toward a chair, and he sat, probably too exhausted to argue. She heated water, found clean cloth, and began carefully washing the blood from his face and hands. What happened? She asked quietly. 8 of them, Crowley's gang. They came for the cattle, figured we'd be easy pickings with Samuel gone. Jack's voice was flat, emotionless, reporting facts. Bull and the boys drove them off. We lost some stock, but not as much as they wanted. Tommy took a bullet to the shoulder. Jose got clipped in the leg. Nothing fatal, but they'll need looking after. Bull had mentioned he'd gotten word from a drover passing through. Crowley's gang had hit another ranch up in Montana Territory 2 days ago. Killed 3 men, took their herd. They were getting bolder, more desperate. Federal marshals were tracking them now. And you? Told you. Just a graze. But Maggie could see the truth in the set of his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. This wasn't just a graze. This was a close call, a reminder of how quickly death could come in this wild place. They'll come back, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Jack's eyes met hers, and in them, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Not fear, but certainty. The grim knowledge of a man who'd seen too many battles, who knew that wars didn't end with a single skirmish. Crowley doesn't give up easy. He wants this land, wants the cattle, but more than that, he wants what Samuel found. The silver. Samuel liked to talk when he drank, liked to brag about his prospects, his plans, and he drank in every saloon from here to Cheyenne. Jack stood wincing slightly as some injury Maggie hadn't noticed made itself known. Someone heard him talking, someone who knew Crowley would pay good money for information like that. Before Maggie could respond, footsteps sounded on the porch. The door opened to reveal Bull, his silver hair disheveled, his shirt stained with blood that might have been his own or might have belonged to someone else. "Boss, you need to come look at something," Bull said. His face was grim. "We found something in the barn." Jack grabbed his rifle without hesitation, already moving toward the door. Maggie followed, pulling a shawl around her shoulders against the cold. Rose was sleeping peacefully in her cradle near the stove, safe for the moment. The barn was lit by lanterns held by ranch hands, their faces shadowed and strange in the flickering light. Jose sat on a hay bale, his leg wrapped in makeshift bandages, his usually cheerful face drawn with pain. Tommy lay on a pile of blankets, his shoulder heavily bandaged, his young face pale as milk. But both men were alive, conscious, watching as Jack approached the thing Bull wanted him to see. It was a man, or what was left of one. He lay in the straw near the back of the barn, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and spreading. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something only he could see. "One of Crowley's men," Bull explained. "Jose shot him off his horse during the fight. By the time we found him, he'd crawled in here. Won't last the night." Jack knelt beside the dying man, his face expressionless. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyes tried to focus on Jack's face. He was maybe 40, with a weathered face and hands that told the story of a hard life. Not a bad man necessarily, but one who'd made bad choices. "Water," the man rasped. Bull brought a canteen, and Jack helped lift the man's head enough to drink. Most of the water ran down his chin, but some made it past his lips. "What's your name?" Jack asked. "Don't matter now." The man coughed and blood flecked his lips. "I'm a dead man." "Then you've got nothing to lose by talking." "Why does Crowley want my land?" The dying man laughed, a wet, bubbling sound. "You really don't know, thought you were smarter than that Dalton. Your brother he knew. That's why Crowley killed him." "The gold claim," Jack said flatly. "Gold." The man coughed again, harder. "And silver. Whole damn mountain full of it according to the survey maps your brother had. Enough to make a man richer than God. Crowley found out, made your brother an offer, but Samuel was greedy, wanted it all for himself. So Crowley shot him, took the maps. If Crowley has the maps, why does he still need the land? Because maps ain't claims. Your brother filed legal papers before he died, made himself the rightful owner of the mineral rights. Without those papers, without the land itself, Crowley can't touch the silver. But if you die, if the ranch gets sold to pay debts, Crowley's got men ready to buy it cheap." The man's breathing was getting shallower, his words coming slower. "You're a dead man, Dalton. You just don't know it yet." "We'll see about that," Jack said quietly. The man tried to laugh again, but only managed another cough. His eyes were glazing over the light in them, dimming like a lamp running out of oil. "Tell my sister in Kansas City, tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I tried to be better." Then he was gone, his last breath rattling out of him with a sound like wind through dead leaves. Jack stood slowly, his face carved from stone. Bull gets some of the men to bury him decent. Even outlaws deserve that much. "Jose, how's your leg?" "I'll live, boss." Jose's accent thickened with pain. "The bullet went through clean. Doc Chen can stitch it proper when she comes." "Tommy." The young man tried to sit up, winced, and settled for a weak smile. "Just a scratch, Mr. Dalton. I'll be back to work in no time." It was a lie. The bandage on Tommy's shoulder was already soaking through with fresh blood. But the boy's eyes were bright with the desperate need to prove himself, to show he was man enough for this life he'd chosen. Jack seemed to recognize that need because his voice softened slightly when he spoke. "You stood your ground when it counted, Tommy. Fought like a man twice your age. That takes real courage, and I won't forget it." Tommy's face flushed with pleasure despite his pain. "Thank you, sir." Maggie had been watching this exchange from the barn door, feeling like an intruder on a moment meant for men. But now Jack turned to her and she saw something new in his eyes. Not just the cold calculation she'd grown accustomed to, but something warmer. Respect, maybe, or the beginning of trust. You should get some sleep, he said. Sun will be up in a few hours and Rose will need you. What about you? I'll be here. Someone needs to keep watch, make sure Crowley doesn't try again before dawn. Then I'll bring you coffee, Maggie said. It wasn't a question. She returned to the house, fed more wood into the stove, and set water to boil. While she waited, she checked on Rose, who was still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the violence that had erupted around her. Looking at the baby's innocent face, Maggie felt a fierce protective surge that surprised her with its intensity. This child had lost so much already. Both parents gone before she could know them. She deserved better than to grow up in the shadow of outlaws and gold claims and men who would kill for money. They all deserved better. Maggie carried a pot of coffee and 2 cups back to the barn. Jack was standing just outside the door, his rifle cradled in his arms, his eyes scanning the darkness for threats that might be lurking beyond the lantern light. "You're still here," he said, but there was no reproach in his voice. If anything, he sounded pleased. "I said I'd bring coffee." Maggie poured 2 cups, handed one to Jack, and took a sip from the other. It was strong and bitter, but the heat was welcome in the cold pre-dawn air. They stood in silence for a while, drinking their coffee and watching the stars fade as the sky began to lighten in the east. It was a companionable silence, comfortable in a way that surprised Maggie. She'd expected to feel awkward with this taciturn man, but instead she felt oddly at peace. "The cradle you're using for Rose," Jack said suddenly, "the one from the loft, it doesn't bother you, knowing it was meant for my son, should it?" Most women would think it was morbid, using a dead child's things. Maggie considered this. "I think it would be more morbid to let something so beautiful go to waste. You made that cradle with love, Jack. That love shouldn't die just because the child it was meant for did. Rose is benefiting from it now. In a way, your son's memory is helping to protect her." Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then so softly Maggie almost didn't hear it, he said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For understanding. For not making me explain things I don't know how to put into words." Before Maggie could respond, the sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The beautiful Wyoming dawn seemed almost obscene after the violence of the night, too perfect for a world that had just seen men die. "I should check on the cattle," Jack said, draining the last of his coffee. "Make sure we didn't lose too many head. And I should tend to Tommy and Jose. They'll need clean bandages and something for the pain." Jack looked at her, then really looked at her, and Maggie felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. "You didn't run," he said. "When the shooting started, when I told you to hide in the cellar, most people would have panicked. You took care of Rose, helped with the wounded. You handled yourself like someone born to this life. What else would I have done? Most women from Boston would have fainted dead away, or demanded to be taken to safety immediately." A ghost of a smile touched Jack's lips. "You're not what I expected, Maggie Sullivan." "Neither are you, Jack Dalton." The moment stretched between them, full of things neither of them knew how to say. Then Rose's cry drifted from the house, breaking the spell. "Duty calls," Maggie said, turning toward the house. "Maggie," Jack's voice stopped her. "What you said about the cradle, about love not dying, you're right. I just wanted you to know that." Maggie smiled, feeling something warm bloom in her chest. "Get some sleep, Jack. Even cowboys need rest." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and this time there was definitely a smile in his voice. The next 3 days passed in a blur of work and worry. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived from town the morning after the attack, a compact woman in her mid-40s with intelligent eyes and capable hands. She stitched Jose's leg and rebandaged Tommy's shoulder with the efficiency of someone who'd tended many gunshot wounds in her time on the frontier. "You're lucky, Wahan," she told Tommy while Maggie assisted with the bandaging. "Another inch to the right and that bullet would have severed an artery. You'd have bled out before anyone could help you." Tommy's face went pale, but he managed a weak grin. "Guess luck's on my side then, Doc." "Luck and stupidity often go hand in hand with young men," Doc Chen said dryly. But her touch was gentle as she secured the bandage. "Rest for at least a week. No heavy lifting, no riding. And if this wound starts to smell bad or the skin around it turns red, you send for me immediately. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." Doc Chen turned to Maggie, her dark eyes assessing. "You're the mail order bride, the one who came for Samuel." I am, or I was. I'm not sure what I am now. You're alive, which is more than some can say out here. Doc Chen picked up her medical bag and gestured for Maggie to follow her outside. Once they were out of Tommy's earshot, she stopped and fixed Maggie with a penetrating stare. Jack told me you kept your head during the attack. Took care of Rose, helped with the wounded after. That true? I did what anyone would have done. No, you did what someone brave does. Most women would have fallen apart. Doc Chen paused. I knew Hannah, Jack's first wife. Sweet girl, but she wasn't built for this life. The frontier broke her long before childbirth killed her. You, though, you might be different. I don't know about that, Maggie said. I'm just trying to survive until spring. Spring might be a long time coming. Doc Chen glanced toward the barn where Jack was working with Bull. Crowley won't give up. He's got the taste for this now, knows there's real money at stake. And Jack, stubborn as his father was, won't sell. Won't run. He'll stay and fight, even if it kills him. And what should he do? That's not for me to say. But I'll tell you this. That man hasn't let anyone close since Hannah died. Hasn't allowed himself to feel anything but duty and anger. Then you show up, and I see something in his eyes I haven't seen in 5 years. Doc Chen's expression softened. Hope. Don't break it, Miss Sullivan. He couldn't survive that a second time. Before Maggie could respond, Doc Chen was walking toward her wagon, calling out goodbyes and instructions about wound care. Maggie stood alone in the cold morning air, thinking about hope and survival, and the complicated man who'd taken her in. Doc Chen had also mentioned she'd posted Maggie's letter to Professor Whitman when she'd been in Denver last week. A small thing, but it might matter later. That afternoon, Bull Morgan came to the kitchen door with news from town. Sheriff Ben Cooper had been asking questions about the attack on Dalton Ranch, gathering evidence against Crowley's gang. But there was other news too, the kind that made Bull's weathered face grave. There's a man in town, Bull said, accepting the cup of coffee Maggie offered. Name of Victor Hayes. Came in on yesterday's stage from Denver. He's been asking about you, Miss Sullivan. Showing folks a photograph saying you're his missing fiancée. Maggie's blood turned to ice. The cup she'd been holding slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. Bull was on his feet immediately, his hand on her shoulder, steadying her before she could fall. Miss Sullivan, you all right? I'm fine, Maggie managed, though her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. Distant, hollow. I just need a moment. But Jack had heard the commotion and was already striding into the kitchen, his eyes sharp and assessing. He took in the broken cup, Maggie's pale face, Bull's concerned expression, and his jaw tightened. What happened? He demanded. There's a man in town claiming to be Miss Sullivan's fiancé, Bull explained. Victor Hayes says she ran away from their engagement, owes him money. It's not true, Maggie said, quickly finding her voice. She looked directly at Jack, willing him to believe her. I was never engaged to Victor Hayes. He's my stepfather's business partner. After my mother died, he decided I should marry him. I refused. He became insistent. How insistent? Jack's voice was dangerously quiet. Maggie remembered Victor's study, the locked door, his hands on her shoulders, pushing her against the desk. Remembered the letter opener in her hand, the cold metal pressing against his throat as she'd promised to kill him if he ever touched her again. Insistent enough that I had to threaten him with a weapon to make him stop, she said. The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jack's face went absolutely still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. Bull's hand tightened on Maggie's shoulder in a gesture that might have been sympathy or solidarity or both. What does he want? Jack asked Bull, though his eyes never left Maggie's face. Says she stole money from him before she left Boston. $300. He's got the sheriff half convinced she's a thief who needs to be returned to Boston to face charges. That's a lie, Maggie said, her fear beginning to transform into anger. I never took a cent from Victor Hayes. I worked as a seamstress for 2 years to save money for the train ticket west. Every penny was earned honestly. Sheriff Cooper knows Hayes is lying, Bull continued, but Hayes has papers, documents that look official, and he's got 5 men with him who claim to be bounty hunters legally hired to retrieve a fugitive. Bounty hunters or hired guns? Jack's question was sharp. Bit of both, I'd wager. They're staying at the saloon, making it clear they're not leaving without Miss Sullivan. Bull shifted uncomfortably. There's more, boss. Hayes has been talking to folks about the ranch, about your brother's death, about the gold claim. Word is he's offered to buy the mineral rights for $5,000 cash. Jack's expression didn't change, but Maggie saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. Let me guess. He wants to make the deal contingent on me returning Maggie to him. That's about the size of it, yes, sir. The pieces were falling into place now, the pattern emerging like a photograph developing in chemical bath. Victor Hayes hadn't come west just for Maggie. He'd come for the silver, for the fortune buried in the northern hills. Crowley's attack, the timing of Hayes' arrival, the convenient story about Maggie being a thief, it was all connected. They're working together, Maggie said aloud. Hayes and Crowley. Hayes heard about the silver claim somehow, probably through his business connections in Denver. He hired Crowley to force you off the land to make the ranch vulnerable. When that didn't work, he came himself with a new plan. Use me as leverage. Jack looked at her with something that might have been respect or might have been the beginning of something deeper. Smart woman. That's exactly what I was thinking. So what do we do? Bull asked. Before Jack could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. Multiple riders coming fast up the ranch road. Jack was already moving, grabbing his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. Bull, get to the barn. Tell Jose and the boys we might have trouble. Maggie, take Rose to the cellar like before. No, Maggie said firmly. I'm staying. Maggie, if that's Hayes, then he needs to see that I'm not afraid of him anymore. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin. I ran from him once. I won't do it again. Jack studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but you stay behind me. And if shooting starts, you get Rose to safety. Agreed. Agreed. The riders pulled up in front of the house just as Jack and Maggie stepped onto the porch. There were 6 of them, and even in the fading afternoon light, Maggie recognized the man at the front. Victor Hayes sat his horse like a man unaccustomed to riding, stiff and uncomfortable, but trying to hide it. He was in his mid-40s, handsome in the way of men who spent money on their appearance. His clothes were expensive, his horse costly, his saddle tooled with silver conchos that caught the light. Behind him rode 5 hard-looking men with the unmistakable air of professional violence about them. Not cowboys or ranchers, but hired guns. Their eyes scanned the ranch with the practiced efficiency of men evaluating tactical positions and escape routes. Margaret, Victor said, his voice dripping with false concern. Thank God I've found you. Your poor mother has been sick with worry. My mother is dead, Maggie said coldly. She died 6 months ago, Victor. You know that because you were at her funeral. A flicker of annoyance crossed Victor's smooth face before he smoothed it away. Of course, forgive me. Grief has made me confused. I meant your stepmother. I have no stepmother. My mother was your business partner's wife and she's gone. Whatever claim you think you have on me died with her. Now, Margaret, let's be reasonable. Victor dismounted with the careful movements of a man trying not to look foolish. You ran away from home owing a considerable debt. $300 that you took from my safe. I've come to collect that debt and bring you home where you belong. She doesn't owe you anything, Jack said, his voice flat and hard. And she's not going anywhere with you. Victor's eyes shifted to Jack, assessing him the way a man might assess a dog he was considering purchasing. And you are at Bushgun, Jackson Dalton. This is my ranch and Miss Sullivan is under my protection. Protection? Victor's laugh was oily condescending. From what exactly? From paying her debts, from facing the consequences of her theft. I have legal documents here, Mr. Dalton signed by a magistrate in Boston. Miss Sullivan is wanted for larceny. These men with me are legally deputized to return her to Massachusetts to stand trial. Then you'll need to present those documents to Sheriff Cooper, Jack said. He's the law in this territory, and if your papers are legitimate, he'll handle it proper. Oh, I fully intend to involve the sheriff. Victor's smile was smug. But I thought I'd extend a courtesy first, man to man. I understand you've had trouble with outlaws recently. Lost some cattle, lost your brother not long ago. These are difficult times. I could make them easier. How generous of you, Jack said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. I'm prepared to purchase the mineral rights to your northern property for $5,000. Cash money paid immediately. That would cover your brother's debts and leave you with capital to rebuild. All I ask in return is that you release Miss Sullivan to my custody. Surely you can see that's a fair trade. I don't sell people, Jack said, and the mineral rights aren't for sale at any price. Victor's pleasant mask slipped, revealing the hardness beneath. Be careful, Mr. Dalton. You're in a precarious position. Outlaws circling your property debts, mounting winter coming on. My offer is generous, but it won't remain available indefinitely. Then I guess we're done talking. Jack shifted his rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at Victor, but making it clear he could if necessary. You've got 10 seconds to get off my land. After that, I stop being polite. The hired guns tensed hands, drifting toward their weapons. For a moment, the air crackled with the possibility of violence. Then Victor raised a hand, stopping his men. This isn't over, he said, looking past Jack to Maggie. I came all this way for you, Margaret. I won't leave without you. One way or another, you're coming back to Boston with me. Over my dead body, Maggie said quietly. That can be arranged. Victor replied, his voice pleasant, as if discussing the weather. Then he remounted his horse and turned toward his men. We'll return to town, but we'll be back with the sheriff and proper legal authority. They rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving Jack and Maggie standing on the porch. Bull emerged from the barn, Jose limping beside him, despite his wounded leg. Tommy stood in the doorway, his good hand resting on a pistol. That was Victor Hayes, Bull asked. That was him, Maggie confirmed, and she was surprised to find she was shaking. Not from fear, but from suppressed rage. He hasn't changed. Still believes money and intimidation can get him whatever he wants. We need to talk to Sheriff Cooper before Hayes poisons that well any further, Jack said. Bull, can you ride into town tonight? Already saddling my horse, boss. Tell Cooper everything Maggie told us. About Hayes, about how he tried to force her into marriage, about the timing of his arrival matching up with Crowley's attacks. Cooper's a smart man. He'll see the pattern. What about the claim that I stole money from Hayes, Maggie asked. Even if Cooper believes me, if Hayes has legal papers from Boston, then we fight it in court, Jack interrupted. We get you a lawyer. We prove Hayes is lying. With what money you said yourself you can barely cover Samuel's debts. Jack was quiet for a moment, his jaw working as he considered options. Then he looked at Maggie with an expression she couldn't quite read. There might be a way, he said slowly. A legal way to protect you that doesn't require lawyers or court battles. What way? Marriage. The word dropped between them like a stone into still water. If you were my wife, Hayes would have no claim on you. Married women are the legal responsibility of their husbands. He couldn't take you back to Boston without my permission. Maggie stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. You want to marry me for legal protection? I want to keep you safe, Jack said. This seems like the most practical way to do it. Practical. The word stung more than it should have. Of course, this would be a practical arrangement. What else could it be? Jack had made his feelings clear. He'd loved once, lost everything, and built walls around his heart too high for anyone to scale. But looking at him now, at the tension in his shoulders and the carefully blank expression on his face, Maggie wondered if he was being entirely honest. With her or with himself? That's a terrible reason to get married, she said quietly. Maybe, but it's an honest one, and it would work. What about you? What do you get out of this arrangement besides another mouth to feed and another person to worry about? Jack's eyes met hers, and for just a moment his mask slipped. She saw loneliness there, and exhaustion, and something that might have been hope, struggling to survive in barren soil. Rose needs a mother, he said. The ranch needs a woman's touch, and I need someone I can trust at my back. Someone brave enough to stand on this porch and tell Victor Hayes to go to hell. That's worth more than gold to me. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was honest, and there was a kind of respect in it that Maggie found herself valuing more than pretty words would have been. I need to think about it, she said. Fair enough, but don't think too long. Hayes will be back probably tomorrow with whatever legal fiction he's concocted. We need to be ready. That night, Maggie lay awake in her room while Rose slept peacefully in the carved cradle. She thought about Jack's proposal, about the strange path that had brought her from Boston to this wild place. She'd come west to escape one forced marriage only to be offered another. Except this one was different. Jack wasn't trying to trap her or control her. He was offering partnership, protection, a place to belong. But was that enough? Could she marry a man who saw her as a practical solution rather than someone he truly wanted? A man still so deeply in love with his dead wife that he couldn't see anyone else? Maggie rose from bed and moved to the window. Outside, the Wyoming night was vast and star-filled, beautiful in a way that still took her breath away. She'd been here less than 3 weeks, but already this place had worked its way under her skin. The clean air, the open spaces, the honest work, and honest people. Even the danger felt clean, somehow straightforward, in a way Boston's drawing room politics had never been. And Jack, complicated, damaged, stubborn Jack Dalton, who'd taken her in when he had every reason not to, who taught her the rhythms of ranch life and helped her care for Rose, and stood with her against threats both external and internal, who'd built a cradle for a son he'd never see grow up, and then let another man's daughter sleep in it because love shouldn't be wasted. Maybe that was enough. Maybe practical partnership built on mutual respect was a better foundation than romantic love anyway. God knew her mother's love match with her father had ended in heartbreak, and her mother's second marriage had been a nightmare. But as Maggie stood at the window looking out at the starlit darkness, she found herself wanting more, wanting the impossible, wanting Jack to see her not as a practical solution, but as a woman, as someone worth choosing, not because she was convenient, but because she mattered. Morning came with no answers, only the familiar routine of caring for Rose and preparing breakfast. Jack appeared at dawn, looking like he'd slept as poorly as Maggie had. They moved around each other in careful silence, both aware of the unspoken question hanging between them. Bull returned from town just after sunrise with news. Sheriff Cooper wanted to see both Jack and Maggie in his office that afternoon. Hayes had filed formal complaints, and Cooper needed to hear both sides before making any decisions. They rode to Sweetwater together, Jack on his big buckskin gelding and Maggie on a gentle mare named Clover. Jose stayed behind to watch the ranch, his wounded leg still healing, but his rifle at the ready. Tommy wanted to come desperate to prove himself, but Jack ordered him to rest. The boy's shoulder needed time to heal properly. Sweetwater was a small town, one main street, lined with false-fronted buildings and enough saloons to serve a population 3 times its size. People stopped to stare as Jack and Maggie rode past. News of the mail-order bride and the Boston businessman looking for her had spread quickly, as news always did in small communities where entertainment was scarce. Sheriff Ben Cooper's office was a squat building at the end of the street, distinguished by iron bars on the windows and a faded sign that read law. Cooper himself was a solid man in his early 50s, with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest and eyes that had seen enough of human nature to be both skeptical and kind. "Mr. Dalton, Miss Sullivan," he greeted them as they entered. "Thank you for coming. We've got ourselves a situation that needs sorting." Victor Hayes was already there, sitting in a chair near the sheriff's desk with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. He stood when Maggie entered, his smile predatory. "Margaret, how kind of you to come. Sheriff Cooper and I have been discussing your situation." "Sit down, Mr. Hayes," Cooper said mildly. "I haven't made any decisions yet, and I won't until I've heard from Miss Sullivan herself." Maggie sat in the chair Cooper indicated, with Jack standing just behind her. His presence was solid and reassuring, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this. "Miss Sullivan," or Cooper began, "Mr. Hayes has made some serious accusations. Claims you stole $300 from his safe before leaving Boston. He's got what looks like a legal warrant for your arrest. Before I act on it, I need to hear your side." Maggie took a deep breath and told the truth. All of it. Her father's death, her mother's remarriage to a weak man who'd partnered with Victor Hayes, Hayes's increasingly inappropriate attention after her mother died, the night he'd cornered her in his study and made his intentions clear, her threat with the letter opener, her desperate flight west. "I never stole a penny from Victor Hayes," she finished. "I worked it for every cent I had. If he's claiming otherwise, he's lying." "That's a serious accusation," Hayes said smoothly. "Sheriff, I have bank records showing a withdrawal of $300 from my account on the same day Margaret disappeared. I have testimony from my housekeeper that she saw Margaret in my study that evening. The evidence is clear." "The evidence is manufactured," Maggie shot back. "You withdrew that money yourself and claimed I took it. You're using a false warrant to force me to return to Boston, where you can control me." "Sheriff, this is absurd," Hayes said. "The girl is clearly unstable. She's been living in sin with Mr. Dalton, caring for a bastard child, consorting with criminals. Her judgment cannot be trusted." Jack moved so fast Maggie barely saw it. One moment he was standing behind her chair. The next he had Victor Hayes by the throat, slammed against the wall with enough force to rattle the wanted posters hanging there. Call her a liar again. Jack said, his voice deadly quiet. See what happens. Jack, let him go, Cooper ordered, moving to intervene. This isn't helping. Jack held Hayes for another moment, long enough for the other man's face to turn red, then released him. Hayes stumbled away, gasping and rubbing his throat. You'll hang for that, Hayes wheezed, assaulting a citizen, threatening. Oh, shut up, Cooper said tiredly. Mr. Dalton, I understand your feelings, but I can't have violence in my office. Sit down, both of you. Jack sat, and Maggie could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a stove. Hayes returned to his chair, his earlier confidence shaken. Now, Cooper continued, I've got a problem here. Mr. Hayes has documents that look official, but I've also got a gut feeling that something's not right about this whole situation. The timing of your arrival, Mr. Hayes, right after the attack on Dalton Ranch. Your interest in mineral rights that you shouldn't know about. Your convenient warrant for a crime that can't be proven. Sheriff, I assure you, I'm not finished, Cooper interrupted. Here's what we're going to do. I'm sending a telegram to Boston to the marshal's office there. I'm going to verify whether this warrant is legitimate or if it's a forgery. That's going to take at least a week, maybe two, depending on weather and telegraph lines. Until I hear back, Miss Sullivan stays put. She's not under arrest, but she's not leaving my jurisdiction either. That's outrageous, Hayes protested. I have legal documents that I'm verifying, Cooper said firmly, and while we're waiting, you're going to stay in town where I can keep an eye on you. No trips to Dalton Ranch. No more threats. You step out of line, Mr. Hayes, and I'll lock you up regardless of what documents you have. Are we clear? Hayes's face darkened with anger, but he nodded stiffly. Perfectly clear, Sheriff. Good. Now get out of my office, all of you. I've got work to do. Outside, the afternoon sun was warm despite the cold air. Maggie stood on the wooden sidewalk trying to process what had just happened. A week, maybe two. That's how long she had before Cooper's investigation either freed her or condemned her. We should get married, Jack said abruptly. Today. Right now. Maggie turned to look at him. Jack, I know it's not romantic. I know you deserve better than a marriage of convenience to a broken-down cowboy. But if you're my wife legally bound to me, Hayes loses most of his leverage. Even if that warrant turns out to be real, he can't force you back to Boston without my consent. Is that the only reason? Maggie asked quietly. Legal protection. Jack was silent for a long moment, his face turned toward the mountains in the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, with something that might have been emotion or might have been the wind. No, he admitted, it's not the only reason. Rose needs you. She lights up when you hold her settles, when you sing. She's lost so much already, Maggie. I don't want her to lose you too. And what about you? Maggie pressed, needing to hear him say it. What do you need? Jack turned to face her fully, and the vulnerability in his eyes nearly broke her heart. I need someone I can trust. Someone strong enough to stand beside me instead of behind me. Someone who looks at my ghosts and doesn't run away. He paused, then added quietly, I need you, Maggie. Not because it's convenient, but because in 3 weeks you've become essential. And that terrifies me more than Crowley or Hayes or any danger I've ever faced. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was honest, raw, and real. And looking at Jack's face, at the hope and fear warring in his expression, Maggie realized she'd already made her decision. Yes, she said, I'll marry you. The relief that washed over Jack's features was almost painful to witness. You're sure? I'm sure, but Jack, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll try to let yourself be happy. Promise me you won't spend our marriage punishing yourself for surviving when Hannah didn't. Jack took her hands in his, and Maggie felt the calluses on his palms, the warmth of his skin, the slight trembling that betrayed his emotions. I promise I'll try. That's all I can give you right now. But I'll try, Maggie. For you and Rose, I'll try. Then that's enough. They found Reverend Timothy Walsh at the small church on the edge of town. The Reverend was a kind-faced man in his 60s who'd known Jack since boyhood. When Jack explained what they needed, Walsh's bushy eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. Marriage today. Jack, are you certain about this? More certain than I've been about anything in 5 years, Jack said. Walsh looked at Maggie, his eyes searching. Miss Sullivan, marriage is a sacred bond, not something to be entered into lightly or for purely practical reasons. Are you doing this of your own free will? I am, Maggie said firmly. And you understand that Mr. Dalton is a widower still mourning his first wife, that he comes with considerable baggage and a dangerous situation. I understand all of that, Reverend. I'm not entering this blindly. Walsh studied them both for another moment, then nodded slowly. Very well, but I'll need witnesses, 2 at minimum. I'll fetch Bull and Doc Chen, Jack said. We can be back within the hour. They were married in the small church as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold. Bull stood as Jack's witness, his weathered face split by a genuine smile. Doc Chen stood for Maggie, her expression knowing and perhaps a bit sad, as if she understood all the complicated emotions swirling beneath this hasty ceremony. Jack had no ring to offer, but he'd fashioned one from a silver dollar hammered and shaped with surprising skill. It was rough and imperfect, but when he slipped it onto Maggie's finger, his hands were steady. I, Jackson Dalton, take you, Margaret Sullivan, to be my lawfully wedded wife. He said, his voice clear and firm. I promise to protect you, to stand beside you, to give you a home and a family. I promise to try to be the man you deserve, even when I fail. I promise to let you into my life, into Rose's life, and to build something new together, even while honoring what I've lost. Maggie's own vows were simpler, but no less heartfelt. I, Margaret Sullivan, take you, Jackson Dalton, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand with you, not behind you. I promise to be a mother to Rose and to make your house a home. I promise to fight alongside you against whatever comes and to remind you every day that surviving isn't a sin, it's a gift. Reverend Walsh pronounced them man and wife, just as the sun touched the western horizon. Jack kissed Maggie with surprising gentleness, his lips warm against hers, his hand cradling the back of her head like she was something precious. When they separated, both slightly breathless Bull let out a whoop and fired his pistol into the air in celebration. Doc Chen laughed and embraced Maggie, whispering, "Be patient with him. He's forgotten how to open his heart, but it's still there. You just have to be brave enough to find it." They rode back to the ranch as the stars began to appear, man and wife in the eyes of Dane and the law. When they arrived, Jose and Tommy had decorated the porch with pine boughs and lit lanterns along the path. Rose was awake, cradled in Jose's careful arms, and she reached for Maggie with a happy gurgle. "Welcome home, Senora Dalton," Jose said with a broad smile. Senora Dalton. The name settled over Maggie like a cloak, foreign but not unwelcome. She was someone new now, someone who belonged to this wild place and these good people. That night, after Rose was asleep and the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Jack and Maggie stood together in the main room of the house. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "I should tell you," Jack said hesitantly. "I don't expect that is, you don't have to, I mean," he stopped, frustrated with his inability to find words. "You're asking if I expect to consummate this marriage," Maggie said gently. "Yes." Jack's ears reddened. "I know this is a practical arrangement. I don't want you to feel obligated." Maggie crossed the space between them and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and fast beneath her palm. "Jack, I married you today, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because somewhere in the last 3 weeks, you've become important to me. Because when I look at you, I don't see a broken man. I see someone brave enough to keep fighting even when it hurts." Jack covered her hand with his eyes searching her face. "I don't know if I can give you what you deserve. I don't know if I remember how to be a husband." "Then we'll figure it out together," Maggie said. "One day at a time. Starting now." She rose on her toes and kissed him, putting into the gesture everything she couldn't yet say with words. Jack responded with a hunger that surprised them both, his arms coming around her, pulling her close. The kiss deepened, grew more urgent, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "Maggie," Jack whispered against her hair. "God help me, Maggie." She took his hand and led him upstairs to the bedroom that had been his and Hannah's, that was now theirs. And there in the darkness, with only starlight filtering through the windows, they came together with a desperate tenderness that spoke of loneliness ended and hope renewed. Afterward, as Maggie lay in Jack's arms, listening to his heartbeat slow, she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For being brave enough to say yes. for giving me a reason to remember what it feels like to be alive." Maggie turned in his arms so she could see his face. "I should be thanking you. You gave me a home when I had nothing. You've given me a purpose, a family. You've given me Rose." "We gave each other what we needed," Jack said. "That's what partners do." Partners. It was a good word, honest and true. Maybe love would come later, or maybe it was already growing in the spaces between them, too new and fragile to name. Either way, Maggie was content. She fell asleep in her husband's arms in a house that was becoming a home, and for the first time since leaving Boston, she felt truly safe. The peace lasted exactly 3 days. On the morning of the fourth day after their wedding, Sheriff Cooper arrived at the ranch with news that made Maggie's blood run cold. The telegram from Boston had arrived. Victor Hayes's warrant was legitimate. "I'm sorry, Maggie," Cooper said, his face genuinely regretful. "The Boston marshal confirms that Hayes filed charges and a judge issued the warrant. I have no choice but to honor it." "She's my wife now," Jack said, his voice hard. "She's under my protection, my legal responsibility." "I understand that, Jack. And normally a husband's jurisdiction would supersede. But this warrant was issued before your marriage. It takes precedence." Well, Cooper shifted uncomfortably. "I have to take her in, but I promise you I'll make sure she gets a fair hearing. And if Hayes' story doesn't hold up under scrutiny, I'll release her immediately." "You're not taking her anywhere," Jack said, and his hand moved toward his gun. "Jack, don't," Maggie said, quickly placing herself between him and the sheriff. "This isn't the way. If you shoot a lawman, you'll hang. Then what happens to Rose? What happens to the ranch?" Jack's face was anguish, torn between duty and love, between law and loyalty. Maggie could see him struggling, could see the moment when brutal pragmatism won over protective instinct. "How long?" he asked Cooper. "Hearing set for tomorrow. Judge Morrison is riding in from Cheyenne. He'll hear both sides and make a ruling. And if he rules against her, then I'll have to transport her back to Boston to stand trial." Cooper's voice was kind but firm. "I'm sorry, Jack. I truly am. But this is the law." Maggie spent that night in Sweetwater's small jail, a single cell with a cot and a blanket. Doc Chen brought her dinner and stayed to talk, offering what comfort she could. Bull came by with messages from Jack, promises that everything would be all right, that they'd fight this together. But lying alone on the narrow cot, staring at the ceiling, Maggie felt hope slipping away. Hayes had been planning this 4 months, maybe longer. He had money connections, documents that looked real enough to fool a Boston judge. What chance did she have against that? The hearing the next day was held in Sweetwater's town hall, the largest building available. It seemed like half the town crowded in to watch, drawn by the drama of a mail-order bride accused of theft. Judge Morrison was a stern man in his 60s with iron gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He listened as Hayes presented his case, laying out a narrative that painted Maggie as a disturbed young woman who'd stolen from her benefactor and fled west to escape justice. Hayes's lawyer was slick and well-dressed, his arguments polished and convincing. He presented bank records, testimony from Hayes's servants' character references that portrayed Hayes as a pillar of Boston society and Maggie as an ungrateful thief. When it was Maggie's turn to testify, she told the truth as clearly and calmly as she could, but she had no documents to counter Hayes's, no witnesses from Boston who could speak to his character or lack thereof. All she had was her word against his, and in the eyes of the law, that wasn't enough. Then Jack took the stand. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady and clear, "I've known Maggie for less than a month, but in that time I've seen her face down outlaws without flinching. I've watched her care for my orphaned niece with a gentleness that makes my heart ache. I've seen her work from dawn to dusk without complaint, learning skills she never needed in Boston because she's determined to build a life here." "Mr. Dalton, your character assessment is noted," Judge Morrison said, "but it doesn't address the central question. Did Mrs. Dalton steal money from Mr. Hayes?" "No, she didn't, but I can prove Hayes is lying about why he's really here." Jack pulled out Samuel's journal and the map along with documents he'd obtained from the land office. He laid out the whole story: the silver claim, Crowley's attack, Hayes's convenient arrival, and his offer to buy the mineral rights. The pattern of violence and intimidation designed to force the Daltons off their land. "Hayes doesn't want Maggie for justice," Jack concluded. "He wants her as leverage. He wants to use her to get his hands on a fortune in silver. And he's willing to send an innocent woman to prison to do it. Hayes's lawyer jumped up, objecting violently. Your Honor, this is pure speculation. Mr. Dalton has no proof that Mr. Hayes has any interest in mineral claims or that his warrant is anything but legitimate. Actually, I do, said a new voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see a tall man in his late 60s walking down the aisle. He had white hair, kind eyes, and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Snow still dusted his shoulders from the journey, and his travel-worn coat suggested he'd come a long distance. Professor Arthur Whitman, he introduced himself, from Harvard University. I specialize in forensic document analysis. Mrs. Dalton wrote to me nearly a month ago asking me to analyze certain documents. I believe my testimony is relevant to this case. Judge Morrison gestured for Whitman to approach. Professor, this is highly irregular. The hearing has already begun. I understand, Your Honor, but I traveled 2,000 miles to present evidence that may prove Mrs. Dalton's innocence. Surely justice can accommodate a few minutes' delay. Morrison considered, then nodded. Very well. Bailiff, swear in the witness. Professor Whitman took the stand with the calm confidence of a man who'd testified in many courtrooms. He opened a leather satchel and pulled out several documents, spreading them carefully on the witness stand. I've been examining handwriting samples Mrs. Dalton sent me several weeks ago, Whitman began. Samples of her stepfather's bank records, the withdrawal slip Mr. Hayes claims proves the theft, and the warrant itself. I've also examined correspondence and documents that Mr. Hayes has filed in various business dealings. And what did you find, Professor? Morrison asked, leaning forward with interest. I found multiple irregularities, Your Honor. First, the withdrawal slip from Mr. Hayes' account. The handwriting on that slip matches Mr. Hayes' signature on other documents, not Mrs. Dalton's hand. I've used microscopic analysis, ink testing, and pressure analysis to confirm this. The withdrawal was made by Mr. Hayes himself, not by Mrs. Dalton. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Hayes went pale, his lawyer frantically shuffling papers. Furthermore, Professor Whitman continued, raising his voice to be heard over the commotion. The warrant itself contains several irregularities that suggest it was obtained under false pretenses. The dates don't align properly with the alleged crime. The judge's signature appears to have been traced rather than written naturally, and the seal, when examined under magnification, shows signs of being a reproduction rather than an original impression. Judge Morrison banged his gavel for silence. Are you saying this warrant is a forgery, Professor? I'm saying it's highly suspicious, Your Honor. At minimum, it was obtained through fraudulent means. Mr. Hayes presented false evidence to a magistrate in Boston to secure this warrant. I also discovered, Professor Whitman continued, pulling out more documents, that Mr. Hayes made several large payments to a mining company in Denver 3 months ago. Carson Mining Company, to be specific. The same company that's been surveying mineral deposits in this region. I have bank records here showing payments totaling $15,000. It appears Mr. Hayes has been planning to acquire the Dalton silver claim for quite some time. The evidence was damning. Hayes's face had gone from pale to gray, his earlier confidence completely shattered. His lawyer stood speechless, unable to formulate a defense against the meticulous evidence Whitman had presented. Judge Morrison banged his gavel again. Mr. Hayes, do you have anything to say to these accusations? Hayes stood slowly, and Maggie could see the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing his options, trying to find a way to salvage his plan. Your Honor, he began smoothly, I can explain. Save it, Morrison interrupted. I've heard enough. Mrs. Dalton, you are free to go. The warrant is dismissed on grounds of insufficient evidence and probable fraud. Sheriff Cooper, I'd like to have a long conversation with Mr. Hayes about attempting to defraud this court, and I'll be writing to the Boston authorities about his conduct. The relief that washed over Maggie was so intense she nearly collapsed. Jack was there immediately, his arm around her waist, holding her steady. It's over, he whispered. You're safe. But it wasn't quite over. Hayes made one last desperate play. As Cooper moved to take him into custody, Hayes suddenly lunged toward the door, shoving past a deputy. But he didn't run for freedom. Instead, he turned back toward Maggie, his face twisted with rage. You think you've won, he snarled, his polished veneer cracking completely. I still have Crowley on retainer. He'll burn your ranch to the ground, Dalton. He'll kill everyone you love, and there's not a damn thing you can do to stop it. Actually, Sheriff Cooper said, stepping forward with a grim smile, there is. Ezra Crowley and what's left of his gang were captured 3 days ago. Cooper's face grew grim as he explained. Crowley made a mistake. He hit a federal payroll wagon up in Montana thinking it was carrying gold for the railroad. Instead, it was carrying 20 armed soldiers. Marshal Cobb and his men were waiting. There was a gunfight at Broken Rock Pass. Crowley lost 5 men, the rest surrendered. He's in federal custody now, awaiting trial for murder theft and attacking a military convoy. He'll hang before summer. Hayes's face went slack with shock, then twisted with rage. He lunged at Maggie, reaching for her with hands curved into claws. But Jack was faster, his fist connecting with Hayes's jaw with enough force to send the man sprawling. That's for every time you made her afraid, Jack said quietly. Then he turned to Maggie and helped her to her feet. Let's go home. They left Sweetwater as man and wife, truly free for the first time. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them processing what had happened. The danger they'd faced, the victory they'd won, the future that was finally truly theirs. Rose was waiting for them, cared for by Doc Chen, who'd stayed at the ranch during the trial. The baby squealed with delight when she saw Maggie reaching out with chubby arms. There's my girl, Maggie murmured, gathering Rose close and breathing in the sweet baby scent of her. Mama's home. That night, after Rose was asleep and the house was quiet, Maggie found Jack standing on the porch, staring out at the stars. She joined him, and he automatically put his arm around her waist, pulling her close. What are you thinking about? She asked. About how close I came to losing you. About how much you've changed my life in such a short time. Jack turned to face her fully. I wasn't honest with you when I proposed. I said it was for practical reasons, for legal protection, but that wasn't the whole truth. What's the whole truth? The truth is I was falling for you, and it scared the hell out of me from the moment you stepped off that mail coach, so determined and brave and completely unsuited for frontier life. You got under my skin. And every day since, you've burrowed deeper until I can't imagine this place without you in it. Maggie felt tears pricking her eyes. Jack, I'm not good with words, he continued, and I'm probably going to mess this up a lot. But I need you to know that this isn't just a practical arrangement anymore. Maybe it never was. I love you, Maggie. Not because you're convenient or because Rose needs you, but because you're you. Because you make me want it to be better than I am. Because you make me believe in second chances. I love you too, Maggie said, the words coming easily now that she allowed herself to feel them fully. I think I have since the night you helped me with Rose's fever. Since you stood beside me against Hayes and Crowley and every other threat. You're a good man, Jack Dalton. The best I've ever known. He kissed her then, deep and thorough and full of promise. When they finally separated, both were smiling. So what happens now? Maggie asked. Now we build a life, Jack said simply. We raise Rose, we work the ranch. We figure out what to do about that silver claim. What will you do about it? Jack was quiet for a moment, considering. I think I'll seal off the mine. Put a marker there for Samuel, let the silver stay in the ground where it belongs. This ranch, this land, it's worth more than any amount of precious metal. It's home, and I'm not trading that for anything. Maggie nodded, understanding and agreeing with the decision. Some treasures weren't meant to be dug up. Some wealth was measured in morning coffee shared on a cold porch, in a baby's laughter, in the steady presence of good people working toward common goals. They stood together under the vast Wyoming sky, husband and wife, in truth, now building something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. The frontier stretched out around them, wild and dangerous and beautiful, full of possibility. And for the first time in 5 years, Jack Dalton looked toward the future with hope instead of dread. For the first time since leaving Boston, Maggie felt like she'd finally come home. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Partners, lovers, family. That was enough. That was everything. Spring came to Wyoming with a riot of wildflowers and the return of birdsong. The winter had been hard, but the Dalton Ranch had survived. More than survived. It thrived. Jack stood on the porch he'd built 20 years ago, with his father watching Rose toddle across the yard chasing a chicken. The child was nearly 2 now, her dark hair gleaming in the morning sun, her laughter ringing out like bells. She had her mother Emily's eyes, but her Uncle Jack's stubborn determination. Behind him, he heard Maggie moving in the kitchen, humming as she prepared breakfast. His wife of 18 months, his partner, his heart. The ranch had changed since Maggie arrived. The main house had been painted, the garden replanted with herbs and vegetables. Curtains hung in the windows, flowers bloomed in pots on the porch. Small touches that transformed a house into a home. Bull had taken to calling Maggie the civilizing influence, though his tone was affectionate. Jose said she'd brought the Luz back to the ranch, the light that had been missing since Hannah died. Even young Tommy, his shoulder fully healed, now looked at Maggie with something approaching worship. They'd sealed the silver mine 3 weeks ago, Jack and Bull together placing heavy timbers across the entrance and marking it with a stone bearing Samuel's name. The fortune buried in those hills would stay buried. Some treasures, Jack had learned, weren't worth the cost of digging them up. Hayes was in prison in Denver awaiting trial for fraud and attempted kidnapping. His hired guns had scattered when Crowley fell. Crowley himself had been hanged in Montana 2 months ago, justice finally catching up to him. The ranch was safe, the debts paid, the future secure. Papa, Rose's voice drew Jack's attention. She'd fallen in her chicken pursuit and was sitting in the dirt looking more surprised than hurt. Jack walked over and scooped her up, brushing dust from her dress. "You're all right, little bit," he said softly. "Just a tumble." Rose wrapped her arms around his neck and planted a wet kiss on his cheek. "Love you, Papa." Jack's throat tightened with emotion. "Love you too, Rose, more than you'll ever know." Maggie appeared in the doorway, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly where their first child together was growing. She'd told him 3 days ago, her eyes bright with green and just a touch of fear. But they'd face this together as they faced everything now. "Breakfast is ready," she called. Jack carried Rose toward the house, toward his wife, toward the future they were building together. The Wyoming wind carried the scent of sage and new grass of possibility and promise. This wasn't the life Jack had planned, but it was the life he'd been given, and he was finally truly grateful for it. Some journeys, he thought, begin with an ending. His had started with Samuel's death, with a stranger stepping off a mail coach into his broken world. But Maggie hadn't just arrived at Dalton Ranch. She'd brought it back to life, had brought him back to life. And that, Jack knew as he kissed his wife and settled Rose in her chair, was worth more than all the silver in the mountains. Worth more than anything he'd ever lost. This was home. This was family. This was everything. The mail-order bride who'd come for a dead man had instead given life to the living. The mourning cowboy who'd thought his heart was buried on a hill with his first wife had learned that hearts could heal, that love could bloom again, even in the harshest soil. They'd built something real together. Something lasting. Something worth fighting for. And as the Wyoming sun rose higher in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold, and promised, the Dalton family sat down to breakfast together. A man who'd learned to live again, a woman who'd found her strength, a child who'd never lacked for love, and a future as wide and open as the frontier itself.